Hello and welcome to week 14 of plant biology here at NICC. This week we're going to move into talking specifically about gymnosperms. Remember, this is continuing our conversation from week 12 where we started talking about systematics, so understanding how our scientific understanding of how the family trees of life, specifically plants for this class, are structured. The last couple of weeks we were talking about non-vascular plants, excuse me, seedless plants, and where we see this transition from things like mosses and other bryophytes into vascular tissue, but still we have reproduction via spores. This week we're going to move into talking about gymnosperms, where we start to see the development of seeds. The reading for this week is coming out of the Biology 2E textbook in Chapter 26.1 and Chapter 26.2. And we're also going to do some reading in Chapter 32.1 for this week as well. So Chapter 26.1 really sort of starts with discussion of the sort of evolutionary history of gymnosperms. 26.2 talks specifically about gymnosperms and how they're structured. And then chapter 32.1 is really talking about reproductive development structures as well. So we're kind of jumping around a little bit, and the reading for this week is in that chapter. We don't need to read the entire chapter this week. We're going to be continuing. It's basically the same chapters for next week, talking about angiosperms. So the development of plants that are getting this fruit development, where you don't get that with the gymnosperms. But this week we're really looking at gymnosperms. So this is in the sort of evolutionary history, we're really starting out talking about where do these first seeds develop. This leap from reproduction via spores that we saw in the ferns and the bryophytes and the algae and all those other photosynthetic organisms, all of those organisms required an aquatic environment to reproduce. When we get the evolutionary leap into the development of a true seed, that opens up a whole new avenue of reproductive possibilities for these organisms. So that's sort of where we're moving through this evolutionary history, and that's where the gymnosperms sort of sit. They're these early adopters of this, we'll call it seed technology, or this seed evolution. So when we have these reproductive structures that we call seeds, we no longer have this requirement that an aquatic habitat is necessary. We also have the development of pollen, which is really the male gametophyte generation, and that's structurally different as well. Again, it allows for this broad dispersal of this genetic material across vast distances. Many of these gymnosperms are wind pollinated, and if anybody's ever parked underneath a pine tree while it's dropping its pollen, you know exactly how much pollen those trees can drop. It can be quite stupendous. But most of that pollination is done via wind, and that genetic information just sort of blows out into the environment and sticks where it can. That's really the first part of chapter 26.1, is this sort of natural history of the development of the gymnosperms. 26.2 talks specifically about gymnosperms, and it starts out where describing the seed anatomy and how it's different than angiosperms. The earlier part of the chapter talks about angiosperms. You can skim that if you'd like to. We will be getting back to it eventually. But the differences between gymnosperms and angiosperms are significant and important to understand when we're talking about plant evolution. But today, again, we're going to focus only on gymnosperms. They use conifers as their model organism for gymnosperms when they're describing these reproductive structures and things like that. It's simply because conifers, or these cone-bearing trees, are the most common. So if you think about any sort of pine tree that you guys are familiar with, that's a conifer and that's a gymnosperm. In this case, we have male cones, or they're sometimes called staminate cones, and these are what are producing the male gametophyte, or pollen grains. Excuse me. And they also have female cones, or ovulate cones, and these produce the female gametophytes. Some plants are monoecious and some are dioecious. There's many reproductive strategies within this group, so depending on what species you're looking at, diversity is immense. So, but there are male and female cones. Whether or not they occur on the same organism is going to depend on the species. The chapter section continues then talking about the diversity of gymnosperms. So again, it starts out with the conifers simply because it's the dominant group. So again, these are things like pine trees, spruce trees, cedar trees. These are the sort of common everyday, I'll call them Christmas tree sort of trees that you guys are used to looking at and seeing in your environments. These plants are adapted primarily for cold and dry or arid conditions. If you think about the leaf shape with these pine needles, this sort of very thick waxy cuticle on this leaf, very narrow leaf. It's really good at preserving water. The structure, the physical structure of these plants also sheds snow, so if it gets snowed on in the wintertime, they don't collapse under the weight very often, or they're less likely to collapse anyways. And so they're really good at surviving through colder temperatures and in drier climates. That's why if you're looking at sort of broad vegetation patterns, and you look at, say, the vegetation in Iowa, we have a mix of deciduous trees and coniferous trees. So we have oak trees and pine trees mixed here just fine. The deciduous trees can exist in this habitat. As you move further north, so as you start getting into, say, upper Minnesota and then up into Canada, we get into what's called the boreal forest, where you have almost exclusively pine trees, or conifer trees anyways, because it's simply too cold and too snowy for most deciduous trees to exist in any large numbers. So these conifers have adapted over time to cold and arid conditions, and that's primarily where we see them, although they can exist in many, many different habitat types. Another group within the gymnosperms are the cycads. Superficially, these plants sort of resemble palm trees. Their leaf structure looks like a palm tree, but they are not palm trees. They are definitely gymnosperms, and they produce a cone, and that cone is often pollinated by beetles, which is unique for gymnosperms. Most gymnosperms pollinate via the wind. Another group that you guys are probably familiar with, or possibly familiar with anyways, are the ginkgos. These are definitely an oddball group within the gymnosperms. The leaf shape of a ginkgo and sort of the way that the ginkgo tree looks, it looks like it should be a deciduous angiosperm sort of tree, but the evolutionary history, the molecular history, and the structures that this tree has are definitely in the gymnosperm group. These are very common as we'll call them street trees. So towns and cities like to plant them because they're attractive trees. One thing that you do often see with ginkgos is that they'll only plant the male trees on the streets. The female trees produce a very foul-smelling fruit when it drops, and people step on it and they really stink. So usually when you see ginkgos as street trees, they're usually male trees. If there are female ginkgo trees on your street, you probably are aware of it. The seeds are stinky, and when they drop, they'll cover the ground. So ginkgo trees are the ginkgo biloba is the last species in this group. They were maintained only by chance by monks in Central Asia. So they are unique in this gymnosperm group. The last group that the book talks about within the gymnosperms are the gnetophytes. It's a silent G at the beginning there. This is a very small group with only 3 genera: the Ephedra, the Gnetophora, and the Welwitschia. Again, these are small, sort of minor groups, and they can be kind of strange-looking plants, especially the Welwitschia. But they are within this gymnosperm group, so they're included in this discussion, but they are not sort of typical gymnosperms in the sense that you guys are used to seeing, like pine trees and things like that. So that wraps up the gymnosperm part of chapter 26. If you move into chapter 32, 32.1 rather, talking about reproductive development structures of plants, you can skip the beginning part where they talk about angiosperms and go strictly, or for this week, go simply to the sexual reproduction and gymnosperms part. Again, we're breaking apart this text to best meet how our discussion is moving, so we don't need to just read through the whole thing. We'll get to the angiosperm parts, looks like next week based on the calendar. So don't fret, we'll get to it. But evolutionarily speaking, the gymnosperms are more primitive than the angiosperms, so we're going to talk about those first. Again, as we've seen with our other plants, the gymnosperms do have this alternation of generations. So they have the sporophyte and the gametophyte generations. The tree in this case, the thing that the Christmas tree that you hang your ornaments on, that Santa puts presents under, that is the sporophyte generation of these organisms. The male and the female gametophytes are housed in the cone structures, and those are the pollens and the ovules, respectively. Cones are kind of a strange reproductive structure. They're made up of structures called bracts, B-R-A-C-T-S, bracts, and those are modified leaves. And within the cone, if it's a male cone, they're called microsporophylls. If they're a female cone, they're called megasporophylls. So microsporophylls produce these small pollen grains. The mega ones, they produce the larger, what eventually becomes a seed. As these cones, either male and female, produce their gametes, the male cone drops the gametophyte out as pollen. That pollen is blown on the wind and comes into contact with the female gametophyte within the cone. Once this contact is made, the male gametophyte starts to produce what's called pollen tube, which is, it just basically bores a hole into the female structures, and that's when pollination occurs. As that pollen tube moves down deeper into those structures and the gametes fuse together to form a zygote, then you have fertilization. There's no fruit developed with gymnosperms because there's no ovary sort of coat to develop into a fruit, so that's really where the name gymnosperm or naked seed comes from, is the development of these sort of naked seed structures that you guys are sort of used to seeing as within these pine cones. If you've ever eaten pine nuts, that's what these structures are. That about should cover what we're going to talk about this week. Again, we're talking about gymnosperms. We're looking at the evolutionary history of gymnosperms, some of the natural history of the gymnosperms, how the gymnosperms fit in systematically to other structures, and then the reproductive systems of the gymnosperms as well. So some good reading for this week, and we'll see you next week.